The late afternoon sun bathed the small, quiet town in a golden glow, but inside the reptile house, a very different atmosphere brewed. Families flocked to the exhibit, their excited chatter filling the air as children pressed their faces against the glass enclosures, marveling at the array of snakes, lizards, and other exotic creatures. The reptile house was famous for its rare collection of animals, attracting visitors from far and wide. Yet, on this particular day, what began as an ordinary visit would soon spiral into something unimaginable, something that would leave the entire town reeling. Among the visitors was a young boy named Jamal. At just 10 years old, he was a curious and bright child, with a love for animals that often had him buried in library books or glued to nature documentaries. Accompanied by his mother, Sheila, he approached the snake exhibit with awe in his eyes, fascinated by the intricate patterns and colors of the creatures. Sheila, always cautious, held his hand tightly, her maternal instincts making her uneasy around the dangerous reptiles. Nearby, an employee named Alan stood in the shadows, seemingly preoccupied with his duties. Alan had been working at the reptile house for years and was known for his extensive knowledge of snakes. However, he also had a reputation for being aloof and unpredictable. He often seemed to harbor a certain disdain for visitors, especially those who didn't appreciate the beauty of the reptiles as much as he did. Today, though, his demeanor was different, darker, more unsettling. As Jamal admired a particularly vibrant green mamba through the glass, Alan's gaze shifted to the boy. Something about the innocent wonder in Jamal's eyes seemed to agitate him. He muttered under his breath, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted a latch on one of the enclosures. No one noticed the quiet storm brewing within Alan, nor the way he lingered near the more venomous snakes, his fingers brushing against the cages as though contemplating something unthinkable. The crowd moved on, and Sheila gently tugged Jamal away, urging him toward the next exhibit. But Alan didn't move. Instead, he watched them go, his expression unreadable. Minutes later, a sudden commotion erupted near the exit of the reptile house. Sheila's panicked voice cut through the air, followed by the frightened cries of other visitors. Jamal had been bitten by a snake that shouldn't have been anywhere near the visitors. Chaos ensued as staff rushed to contain the situation. Sheila clutched Jamal tightly, her face pale with fear as she shouted for help. The boy's small frame trembled as he clung to his mother, his voice barely audible as he whispered, "It hurts, Mom." The sight was heart-wrenching. Alan, curiously absent from the scene, had disappeared. Questions swirled among the staff and visitors. How had a snake managed to get out of its enclosure? And why had it gone after Jamal? As paramedics arrived and worked to stabilize the boy, the reptile house fell eerily silent. Everyone held their breath, waiting for answers that seemed just out of reach. What unfolded in the days that followed would shock not just the community, but the entire nation. Hidden motives, long-buried secrets, and an unimaginable truth would come to light, leaving everyone to question how far a single act of malice could go, and whether justice could ever truly be served. But first, Jamal's life hung in the balance, and the clock was ticking. The ambulance sped through the quiet streets, its sirens cutting through the night as Jamal's life hung in the balance. Sheila sat beside him, her hand clutched tightly in his, her face pale and drawn. She could barely focus on the paramedics who were working frantically to stabilize him. Her mind was racing, replaying the events in the reptile house over and over. How had this happened? How had Jamal, her sweet, curious boy, ended up bitten by a venomous snake? And why was it that none of the staff had noticed the danger until it was too late? The answer, as she would soon learn, was far more complicated and more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. At the reptile house, the panic had quickly spread. Visitors had scattered, some in a daze, others in outright fear. The staff had been caught off guard, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Alan, the employee who had been near Jamal just moments before the attack, was nowhere to be found. The manager, a man named Greg, had rushed to the scene as soon as the commotion began, but even he was at a loss. The snake that had bitten Jamal was a highly venomous species, a black mamba, and it was not a snake that was typically part of the exhibit. How had it escaped? More importantly, how had it gotten close enough to harm a visitor? Greg's mind raced. He'd worked with Alan for years and knew him well enough to recognize that there was something off about the man. Alan was always a bit of a loner, but in recent weeks, his behavior had become increasingly erratic. His temper had flared more often, and his interactions with visitors had grown cold, almost hostile. Greg had noticed it, but he had chalked it up to stress. After all, working with venomous reptiles wasn't a job for the faint of heart. But this was something far beyond what anyone could have predicted. As Greg paced through the darkened corridors of the reptile house, his mind kept returning to one unsettling question. Had Alan intentionally released the snake? The idea was absurd, but the more he thought about it, the more it began to make sense. Alan had always been obsessed with the snakes, almost to an unhealthy degree. He'd once told Greg that he believed only a few people could truly understand the power of venomous creatures. Maybe, Greg thought with a shiver, Alan saw something in Jamal, something that pushed him over the edge. But why? What could Jamal have done to provoke such a reaction? As the evening wore on, Greg's anxiety deepened. He was no closer to understanding the full scope of what had happened, but he knew one thing for certain: the authorities would need to be involved. The incident had been far too serious to ignore, and with a venomous snake still on the loose, the safety of everyone in the building was at risk. He quickly made a call to the police, his hands shaking as he explained what had happened. Meanwhile, Shayla's mind was consumed with a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness washed over her as she sat in the back of the ambulance, watching Jamal struggle to stay conscious. The venom from the snake's bite had already begun to take effect, and she could see the telltale signs of it. His pupils dilated, his skin pale and clammy. It was a terrifying sight, and she could do nothing to help him except pray for a miracle. The paramedics worked quickly, their faces set in grim determination as they administered anti-venom and hooked Jamal up to an IV. Shayla's mind couldn't quiet itself. She replayed the scene at the reptile house again, trying to understand how something like this could happen. Jamal had only been interested in the snakes. He'd always been so fascinated by them. But she had never imagined that one could be so close to him, so dangerous. As a mother, she had done everything in her power to keep him safe, and now this. The fear was almost overwhelming, but Shayla couldn't afford to lose her focus. She had to stay strong for Jamal. No matter how scared she was, she had to believe that he would pull through. Back at the reptile house, the police had arrived, and the investigation was underway. Detectives combed through the building, searching for any clues that could explain how the snake had gotten loose. The first thing they noticed was that the cage holding the black mamba had been tampered with. The lock was loose, as if it had been fiddled with, and the glass enclosure showed signs of having been disturbed. This only deepened the suspicion surrounding Alan. Greg had already informed the police about Alan's erratic behavior, but there was something else, something more disturbing. Alan had been the one to handle the snakes on that particular day, and it wasn't the first time he had shown a strange obsession with them. In fact, he had always treated the reptiles with an almost reverent, fanatical air, talking to them as if they were his only friends. But this was more than just an unhealthy attachment to his work. Something darker was at play, and the detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that Alan had deliberately set the stage for the attack. But where was Alan now? No one knew. He had vanished after the incident, and all attempts to contact him had failed. His sudden disappearance only added to the growing sense of unease. The authorities were now facing not just the mystery of how the snake had escaped, but also the mystery of where Alan had gone, and whether he was a threat to others. As the night wore on, the uncertainty and fear deepened. Jamal was still fighting for his life, and Shayla had no answers. The police were no closer to finding Alan, and the snake was still unaccounted for. The situation seemed to grow more dire with each passing hour, and everyone involved began to realize that the truth was far more complicated than anyone had expected. The next morning, news of the incident spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with outrage, with people expressing shock and disbelief over the events that had transpired. The Reptile House, once a popular family destination, was now the center of a massive controversy. Questions swirled about the safety of the facility, about the staff, and about the possible criminal actions of one of their own. But despite the public outrage, there was one question that everyone wanted answered more than any other. Had Alan intentionally set the snake loose on Jamal, or was this simply a tragic accident? The answer, it seemed, was just out of reach. And as the investigation continued to unfold, the tension only grew. As the days passed, the tension surrounding the Reptile House only grew. The community was in turmoil, divided between those who were demanding justice for Jamal and others who insisted that this was a tragic accident, a rare but unfortunate mishap. But deep down, Sheila knew something wasn't right. She had seen the way the employees had reacted that day. The shock, the confusion, it didn't sit well with her. Alan's absence only fueled her suspicions. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this, something that went beyond a simple snake bite. But what? The police had been relentless in their pursuit of answers, but despite their efforts, Alan had simply vanished. No one knew where he had gone, and there were no leads to follow. Greg, the manager, had done his best to cooperate with the investigation, but he too was becoming increasingly unsettled. The more he thought about Alan, the more he realized that the man had never been quite right. There had always been a strange, almost obsessive energy about him when it came to the reptiles. But had he really gone so far as to intentionally release a venomous snake to harm a child? The thought was almost impossible to fathom. The police had questioned the staff thoroughly, but none of them could provide any concrete information. Most of them had seen Alan only briefly on the day of the incident, and no one had suspected anything out of the ordinary. But then again, no one had been paying close enough attention to the subtle shifts in Alan's behavior. He had always been a bit of an enigma, a man who kept to himself, who preferred the company of snakes over people. He'd never seemed dangerous, at least not in the way that would make someone believe he could do something so heinous. But then a breakthrough came. One of the officers had managed to trace Alan's phone records and found a string of calls made to a mysterious number in the days leading up to the incident. The number belonged to a local animal sanctuary, a small privately run facility that had a reputation for handling rare and dangerous reptiles. The connection was strange, especially since Alan had never mentioned any relationship with the sanctuary. The police decided to investigate further, and what they discovered would cast an even darker shadow over the entire situation. As it turned out, Alan had visited the sanctuary several times in the months leading up to the attack, and the owner of the sanctuary, a woman named Catherine, had been more than willing to speak with the authorities when they asked about him. She confirmed that Alan had developed an intense interest in a particular species of venomous snake, a species that wasn't even on the Reptile House's roster. According to Catherine, Alan had expressed fascination with the idea of releasing one of these snakes into an environment where it could truly test its survival skills. Catherine had been alarmed by Alan's comments, but she had dismissed them as the ramblings of a man who was deeply obsessed with his work. But as the detectives pieced together the fragments of Alan's behavior and motivations, it became clear that his obsession had gone far beyond anything anyone had imagined. Alan had never intended for Jamal to be a random victim. Sheila had been right to sense something darker. This wasn't just an accident. This was calculated. Meanwhile, Sheila struggled with her own turmoil. Jamal had been in the hospital for nearly a week, and though he had begun to show signs of improvement, the trauma of the attack had left him withdrawn and fearful. He had always been the kind of child who approached life with a sense of wonder, but now even the thought of snakes made him tremble. Sheila knew that Jamal's recovery wouldn't just be physical. The emotional scars would take much longer to heal, and as the days passed, Sheila's own anger began to burn more fiercely. She wanted answers, not just for herself, but for Jamal. She wanted to understand why this had happened to her son, and why someone would go to such lengths to harm an innocent child. As she sat by his hospital bed one evening, watching him sleep fitfully, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Greg, the manager of the Reptile house. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it, half expecting it to be more bad news. But the message wasn't what she had expected at all. Greg had written that the police were about to make a significant breakthrough in the investigation. The words on the screen were almost too much to process. Shayla felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly tempered by fear. What could they have possibly uncovered? Could it be that Alan had been planning this for months? Could it have been part of some twisted, long-term plan that was far more sinister than anyone had ever realized? The next day, the police released a public statement. Alan was now a wanted man, and the authorities were urging anyone who had seen him or knew of his whereabouts to come forward. They had discovered something that shocked even the most experienced detectives. Alan had been in contact with a shadowy network of individuals who specialized in illegal reptile trading. The network was known for dealing in some of the most dangerous snakes in the world, and it seemed that Alan had become entangled with them. He had been using the Reptile house as a cover for his dealings, and it appeared that the black mamba, the very snake that had bitten Jamal, was part of an illegal shipment that had somehow made its way into the building. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. It seemed that Alan's obsession with snakes had been about more than just fascination. It had been about power. Power over the creatures he worked with, and power over the lives of the people who unknowingly entered the Reptile house. The detectives now believed that Alan had intentionally chosen Jamal as his target, knowing that the boy's curiosity about the snakes would bring him dangerously close to the black mamba. But why? What had motivated Alan to act out his twisted plan in such a brutal way? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the more the police uncovered, the more questions arose. Alan had seemingly vanished without a trace, and the people who had helped him remained shrouded in secrecy. Who were they, and what role had they played in this dark web of deceit? As Shayla absorbed the news, she felt a mix of emotions flood over her: anger, disbelief, and a deep, unshakable sorrow for the child she no longer recognized. Jamal was still fighting to overcome the trauma of that day, but now Shayla knew that there was something even more dangerous at play. Alan wasn't just a man who had harmed his son. He was part of something much bigger, something that could reach far beyond the walls of the Reptile house. And as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that no one in this small town would ever be the same again. As the investigation deepened, every passing day felt like a ticking time bomb. The more they uncovered about Alan's connection to the underground reptile trade, the more the truth seemed to slip further out of reach. The police had expanded their search, tracking down every lead they could find, but Alan was a ghost. He had vanished from his apartment, his phone records were wiped clean, and his known associates refused to cooperate. It was as if he had planned for this moment, knowing exactly how to disappear without a trace. Sheila, on the other hand, was running out of patience. Jamal's recovery was slow. His physical wounds were healing, but the emotional scars were far deeper. He couldn't bring himself to talk about what had happened, and every time someone mentioned snakes, his face would tighten, his small body trembling with fear. Shayla tried to reassure him, to convince him that he would be okay, but even she wasn't sure anymore. Her son had been marked by something dark and malevolent, and she wasn't sure how they would both get past it. The constant weight of the situation hung over her. Her every waking moment was consumed by worry, not just for Jamal, but for the safety of everyone who had ever visited the Reptile house. As more and more details emerged about the underground reptile trade, Shayla began to wonder just how deep Alan's involvement had been. Was he the only one pulling the strings, or had others been complicit in the scheme? The fact that Jamal had been targeted, of all people, made Shayla think there was more to the story than just an obsession gone wrong. It was almost as if someone had orchestrated the whole thing. Meanwhile, Greg, the manager, had become more anxious with each new revelation. He was tormented by the thought that he might have missed something, that somehow he should have known what Alan was capable of. How had he let this go on for so long without recognizing the signs? The guilt gnawed at him, even though he knew he wasn't directly responsible. But the weight of his inaction felt unbearable. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jamal's face twisted in pain. He had watched it happen, standing by helplessly as the snake slithered free. Had he truly been blind to Alan's growing instability? Or was there something more sinister at play? Something that Alan had kept hidden from everyone, even Greg. The weeks dragged on, and then, just when it seemed like the case would go cold, a breakthrough came in the form of a tip. Someone had spotted Alan in a nearby town, staying in a rundown motel under an alias. The police immediately mobilized, preparing to track him down. Shayla heard about the tip from Greg, who was now working closely with the authorities. Her heart leaped at the possibility that they might finally catch him, that justice might finally be served. But as the days passed, the tension only escalated. Alan was still out there, and he knew they were closing in on him. Shayla couldn't sit still. She began to obsess over the details of the case, reading everything she could find, reaching out to people who might know more about Alan's past. It was then that she uncovered something chilling, something she hadn't anticipated. A year before the attack, Alan had been involved in a similar incident at a different facility. The snake had bitten a child there too, but it had been written off as a tragic accident. The incident had been swept under the rug, and Alan had never been held accountable. Shayla's blood ran cold. Had this all been part of a pattern? Was this his way of getting what he wanted, some twisted sense of control or validation through violence? The more Shayla thought about it, the more convinced she became that Alan wasn't just hiding from the police. He was preparing for something. The underground reptile trade, the mysterious network he was connected to, it all pointed towards something bigger, something more dangerous than just one man's obsession. Was Alan merely a pawn in a much larger game? Were others pulling the strings from the shadows, orchestrating this chain of events for their own gain? In a meeting with the detectives, Shayla pressed them on the possibility that Alan was working with someone else, someone who might have orchestrated the entire incident. They weren't ready to say anything for certain, but the mere suggestion made the tension in the room palpable. Everyone knew the stakes were higher now. If Alan was part of something more dangerous, something criminal, it was no longer just about him. The investigation was about to take a much darker turn, and then the unthinkable happened. The authorities finally tracked Alan to an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It was clear he had been hiding out there for days, maybe weeks. The police set up a perimeter, and tactical team was called in to apprehend him. As they prepared to move in, Shayla sat at home, watching the news with bated breath. Her heart raced, her hands clammy as the hours ticked by. The air felt thick with anticipation. Every detail of the situation was playing out like a nightmare. She imagined Alan in that house, pacing back and forth, waiting for the authorities to find him. He had to know they were coming. Did he have a plan? Was he going to try to escape? Or worse, was he going to strike again? The uncertainty gnawed at her, and a deep sense of dread settled in her chest. As the police closed in, Alan made a move. The tactical team burst into the house, but it was already too late. A shot rang out. Shayla gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The reporters were already camped outside, their cameras trained on the scene. Her phone buzzed with messages, but she couldn't bring herself to look. Everything inside her told her that the end was near, but no one could predict how this story would unfold. And as the hours wore on, the silence grew unbearable. The truth was out there, just beyond their grasp. Shayla knew it. The detectives knew it. But there was no telling how much more darkness lay ahead. Whatever happened next, it was clear that the town would never be the same again. The final moments of the standoff were drawing near, and the world waited, breathless, to find out if they would finally uncover the truth behind Alan's motives and the twisted world he had created, or if they would be too late. The hours stretched on, the tension unbearable as the tactical team moved closer to Alan's hideout. Shayla could barely think straight, her heart hammering in her chest. She had been following the updates on the news, watching as the police prepared to take him down. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for, the end of the nightmare. Alan was going to be caught, and justice would finally be served for Jamal. But as the police moved in, something unexpected happened. A call came through to the news station, an anonymous tip that threw everything into chaos. The message was brief but chilling. Alan isn't alone. He's got backup. You're walking into a trap. Shayla froze, her breath catching. Trap. What did that mean? How could it be? Was someone else involved? Her mind reeled, trying to process the implications of that one sentence. The police, though prepared for a confrontation with Alan, hadn't anticipated this kind of warning. It had never occurred to them that the situation might escalate further. Within moments, the scene outside the house went from tense anticipation to total chaos. The tactical team hesitated, unsure of what to do. They had assumed Alan was a lone actor, hiding in his makeshift hideout. But now the question loomed large. Was Alan just a pawn in a much larger, far more dangerous game? As the team tried to regain control, another chilling detail emerged. The authorities had just discovered that the house Alan was holed up in wasn't abandoned after all. It was being used as a base of operations for an underground network, a network tied to the very reptile trade that had first raised alarm. But it wasn't just about illegal snakes. The operation had deeper roots: human trafficking, organized crime, and violence. The entire situation had spiraled far beyond anything anyone had imagined. The police were now caught between a rock and a hard place. Alan's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It had been the start of something much bigger, a web of criminal activity that had been quietly operating under their noses. The authorities scrambled to reassess their strategy, knowing that Alan wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was a cog in a much more dangerous machine, one with connections that spanned across the state, and possibly further. As the officers regrouped, the scope of what was at stake became painfully clear. Shayla's thoughts raced again, this time about Jamal. He had been the catalyst for everything: his innocence, his curiosity about snakes, and the unthinkable attack that had triggered this series of events. Was Alan's twisted vendetta really about the boy at all, or was Jamal merely a convenient pawn in a much more sinister plan? The news cameras were still rolling, broadcasting live to the nation, and soon the situation outside the house took another turn. The officers had been pushed back, no longer certain of what lay ahead. From inside the house came an eerie, unsettling silence. Then, a low rumble of voices, faint but unmistakable, echoed through the air. It wasn't just Alan anymore. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Shayla's heart skipped. She wasn't just worried about what would happen to Alan. She was terrified of the unknown, the possibility that this criminal network would strike before anyone could stop them. But then a voice crackled over the police radio. "We've located something. It's a hidden room. There's something in it, something we weren't expecting." The team had discovered a secret compartment in the back of the house, a locked door that led to a dark, hidden chamber. They cautiously opened it, but what they found sent shockwaves through everyone involved. Inside the room were several cages, the kind used to hold dangerous creatures. But it wasn't just reptiles in there. There were human figures, men and women, chained and disoriented, their eyes wide with terror. The discovery was staggering. Shayla's blood ran cold as she watched the live footage from the scene, the images of helpless victims on the screen filling her with dread. What had she gotten herself into? This wasn't just about her son anymore. This was a much larger conspiracy, and Jamal was merely a small piece in a puzzle that no one had been prepared to solve. The police team acted swiftly, freeing the prisoners and taking them to safety. But as they gathered information from the survivors, one name kept coming up: Alan. He had been in charge of the operation, but not just as a low-level worker. Alan was involved in something far more insidious. He had been a trusted part of the network, bringing in rare and venomous snakes to trade, and disturbingly, using them as tools in his twisted form of control. It was becoming clear that Alan hadn't just targeted Jamal as a victim. Jamal had unwittingly stumbled upon something much bigger, and now Shayla understood. Her son had been a part of this dark world before he even realized it, just by showing curiosity about the reptiles. But there was more. The people trapped in that hidden room, were they brought in the same way? Were they once curious, naive, like Jamal, and now part of a human trafficking ring that no one had known about? The revelation left Shayla feeling both furious and helpless. The police were scrambling to assess the full extent of the network, trying to find out how deep it went, who else was involved. Meanwhile, the investigation into Alan was gaining momentum, but the longer it took to catch him, the more the clock seemed to tick against them. The authorities knew that they were racing against time. Alan was still out there, and he had already proven that he was willing to go to unimaginable lengths to protect his secrets. But now Shayla felt a new kind of urgency. The truth was more twisted than she could have imagined, and as the police closed in on Alan, she realized that the stakes were higher than ever. Could they find him before we could strike again? Would they be able to dismantle the criminal network before it spread further? And more terrifyingly, was Alan's involvement just the tip of the iceberg? Shayla could feel the weight of these questions pressing down on her, knowing that the answers lay just ahead. But no one could predict how the story would unfold. Everything was about to change, and no one, not even Shayla, could prepare for what was coming next. The moment had come. Shayla could feel the air thicken with every passing second, the tension mounting as the police moved in on Alan's last known location. Every fiber of her being screamed that this was the moment they would finally catch him. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The discoveries they had made, the hidden room, the trafficking ring, the snakes, everything pointed to a much larger network, one that had its claws deep into the fabric of the town. And Alan, somehow, was at the center of it all. She watched the live footage on her phone, her breath shallow as the police surrounded the decrepit building. They had tracked Alan to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The area was eerily quiet, no sign of movement, as if the place had been waiting patiently for this moment. Shayla's heart raced. She couldn't help but think about Jamal, her son, who had been the catalyst for everything. Jamal, who had suffered the horrors of that snakebite. Shayla had been waiting for this day, hoping for closure, hoping for justice. But as the hours dragged on, her fear only grew. What if they didn't catch him in time? What if Alan had planned something else, something worse? The police breached the door, guns drawn. They moved cautiously through the building, their radios crackling with reports. But Alan wasn't there. For a moment, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. The officers spread out, searching every corner, every room. Shayla's pulse thudded in her ears as the minutes ticked by. It felt like an eternity. The whole town was watching now, waiting for this moment to finally end. And then, just as it seemed like the trail had gone cold, a voice came through the police radio. "We found him. He's not alone." The words hit Shayla like a punch to the gut. Alan was there, hidden in plain sight. But there was something more. They had found him in the same hidden compartment where the trafficking victims had been held. The police rushed to the scene, and as they entered the room, they discovered the unimaginable. Alan was surrounded by cages, but these weren't just snakes. They were people, men and women who had been held captive for months, possibly years. The air was thick with fear as the officers quickly freed them, but one thing was painfully clear. Alan hadn't just been a part of this criminal network, he had been the mastermind. As the police moved in to apprehend Alan, a shocking revelation came to light. The man they had been chasing wasn't who they thought he was. Alan, it turned out, wasn't his real name. His identity had been forged years ago, and he had been living under an alias for as long as anyone could remember. The truth was more terrifying than anyone had imagined. Alan had been a sleeper agent for a larger criminal syndicate, one that spanned across borders, trafficking both snakes and humans. The reptiles, the venomous snakes, had been just a cover for his true purpose, smuggling people in and out of the country. Jamal, Shayla's son, had been nothing more than an unintentional pawn in Alan's twisted game. As Alan was taken into custody, he didn't fight back. There was no resistance, no last-minute attempt to escape. He seemed almost resigned to his fate, as if he had known this day would come all along. His cold, calculating demeanor sent a chill down Shayla's spine. The man who had terrorized her son wasn't just some obsessed reptile handler. He was part of a much larger, more insidious operation, a network that had been operating under the radar for years, making untold profits off the backs of both animals and humans. But just as the officers were about to close in on him, Alan delivered one final, shocking twist. With a smirk on his face, he revealed something that no one had expected. "You haven't found everything," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "There's more to this story than you'll ever know." Before anyone could react, a loud bang echoed through the building. The sound was deafening. Shayla's heart skipped a beat. Alan's smirk grew wider as he collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Someone in the shadows had fired a shot. The police rushed to the scene, but it was too late. Alan was dead, his life slipping away as the mystery deepened. The officers immediately began combing through the room, trying to piece together what had just happened. Shayla's stomach twisted with dread. Had someone come to silence Alan before he could reveal the full extent of the criminal empire? Or had Alan planned this all along, knowing the investigation would eventually catch up to him? But just as the officers turned their attention to Alan's body, a hidden drawer was discovered beneath the floorboards. Inside, they found a series of encrypted documents and a flash drive. The files on the drive were unlike anything they had seen before. It contained records of shipments of both reptiles and people spread across countries. There were names, dates, and locations, and most shockingly, one of the names on the list was Jamal's. The discovery hit Shayla like a freight train. Her son's name was linked to something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't just that Jamal had been the victim of a snake attack. He had been unknowingly marked by this network long before he even set foot in the reptile house. Alan hadn't chosen him at random. He had targeted Jamal, and now it was clear why. Jamal had been part of a much larger plan, one that would have forever changed the course of his life. The revelation rocked Shayla to her core. Everything she had thought she knew had been a lie. Alan's death hadn't solved the case. It had only opened up more questions. Who else was involved? And how far did the network stretch? As the police began to unravel the documents, one thing became painfully clear. The criminal empire that Alan had been a part of was far from over. Sheila had thought that the nightmare would end once Alan was caught, that the terror would stop. But the truth was far worse than anything she had ever imagined. The people who had been behind the network were still out there, and they had their eyes set on new victims. Shayla realized that this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. And now, more than ever, she had to fight not only for Jamal's future, but for the safety of everyone who might become a target in this dangerous game. The world Shayla had once known was forever changed. As the days passed, Shayla's mind still raced with the information they had uncovered. Alan's death had only scratched the surface of a much darker, more complicated world, and the documents they had found in that hidden drawer painted a chilling picture of what had been happening in the shadows for years. The human trafficking network Alan was involved in had far-reaching consequences, with dozens of innocent lives caught in its web. The reptile trade, too, was more vast and dangerous than anyone had imagined, serving as a cover for a multitude of illegal activities. The deeper Shayla dug into the files, the more she realized how much danger her son had unknowingly been a part of. But despite the magnitude of what had been revealed, Shayla couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The immediate threat had been eliminated with Alan's arrest, but the lingering questions about the people behind the network still hung heavy in the air. Alan's death, though tragic, had paved the way for answers. The police were now in full force, working tirelessly to track down everyone involved in the trafficking operation. They had begun raiding properties across the country, dismantling the network piece by piece. Every lead they followed brought them closer to bringing down the entire operation. Jamal, though still recovering from his ordeal, had become a symbol of strength. His bravery in the face of fear had inspired many, and the community rallied around him. offering support as he continued to heal from both the physical and emotional scars that Alan's actions had left behind. The boy who had once been a curious visitor at the Reptile House had now become a living testament to the power of resilience and the importance of standing up to injustice. Sheila often found herself thinking about how everything had started. A simple trip to the Reptile House had led to a terrifying chain of events. Jamal had just wanted to learn more about snakes, but what he had found instead was a world of exploitation, cruelty, and danger. It was a reminder of how easily lives could be changed in the blink of an eye, how a moment of curiosity could expose someone to horrors they'd never imagined. But despite all the darkness they had faced, Sheila couldn't ignore the one truth that stood out above everything else. Jamal had survived. He had survived against all odds, and in the end, that was all that mattered. In the months that followed, the police continued their work. The trafficking ring was systematically dismantled, with law enforcement agencies around the world working together to track down every individual involved. Slowly but surely, justice was being served, and while it could never erase the pain or the horror that had been inflicted, it was a start. The victims who had been rescued from Alan's hideout received the support they needed, and many began to rebuild their lives. It was a long and painful process, but there was hope now, something that hadn't been there before. Sheila found herself visiting the Reptile House one last time. She had to. The place where it all began now felt like a distant memory, a haunting reminder of the darkness she had uncovered. But it had also become a symbol of the fight she'd have fought for Jamal and for everyone who had been affected by Alan's actions. She stood in front of the building, taking in the familiar sight of the tanks and the cages where the snakes had once been kept. It was no longer a place of fear. The danger had been eliminated, and now it was just a part of the past, a chapter in their story that they had all moved on from. Jamal, now fully recovered, stood beside her, his hand gripping hers tightly. He had become stronger, more confident, his once soft voice now filled with determination. The trauma he had experienced would never truly go away, but he had learned to live with it, to find peace in the life he had left. As they stood together in front of the Reptile House, Sheila couldn't help but smile, a quiet sense of relief washing over her. She had done everything she could to protect her son, and in the end, it had been enough. But even as the police wrapped up their investigation and the community began to heal, Sheila knew that there was something more important that had been gained from all of this: awareness. The fight against human trafficking, the illegal reptile trade, and the exploitation of innocent lives didn't end with Alan's arrest. It was an ongoing battle, one that required constant vigilance and effort. Sheila had become a vocal advocate for the cause, speaking out at rallies and helping to educate others on the dangers of human trafficking and the hidden networks that preyed on the vulnerable. She wanted to make sure that Jamal's story wasn't just one of survival, it was a story of change, a story that encouraged others to see the signs and speak out before it was too late. In the end, Sheila realized that the greatest weapon they had was not fear, but knowledge. By shining a light on the darkness that had threatened to consume their lives, they had taken away its power. The world might still be filled with danger and uncertainty, but they had learned that there was always hope, always a chance to fight back. As the days went on and life began to return to normal, Sheila held onto one key lesson. The world was unpredictable, and evil could lurk in the most unsuspecting places. But as long as there were people like her, like Jamal, who were willing to face that evil head-on, there was always hope for a better tomorrow. Jamal had been the victim of a system that sought to exploit and destroy, but in the end, he had come out stronger. The fight wasn't over, but they were no longer just surviving. They were living, and they were ready to face whatever came next. And with that, Sheila smiled again, knowing that her son's story wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what they had become because of it. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles lead to the strongest victories, and that there was always light, even in the darkest of times.